Carmen's life was a testament to resilience, sacrifice, and unwavering love for her children. She weathered the storms of widowhood, raising her 4 children alone after her husband passed away. Despite giving her all, her sons grew distant, taking her for granted and leaving her with little more than loneliness and heartbreak. Yet, Carmen's quiet strength remained. Even when the pain of being forgotten by her sons weighed heavily on her, she found solace in the loving letters of her daughter, Sophia. But just when life seemed bleakest, an unexpected reunion with an old friend, Manuel, brought a glimmer of hope back into her life. His kindness reminded her that the seeds of love she had planted years ago were finally blossoming. With Sophia's support, Carmen found the courage to leave behind her old life, embracing a new chapter filled with love, connection, and the possibility of brighter days ahead. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Carmen's life had been a relentless journey, one marked by years of hardship, silent endurance, and a profound, unyielding love for her children. Her husband, a sailor by trade, spent long stretches at sea, leaving her to raise their 4 children almost entirely on her own. Every bit of her strength, every ounce of her love, was poured into her sons and daughter. She took on the challenges of motherhood with a quiet resilience, never allowing herself to falter, even when the weight of it all seemed unbearable. Tragedy struck early in her marriage when her husband passed away, leaving her to navigate the tumultuous waters of life as a widow. The state provided her with modest financial support, along with a small pension, but the real tragedy came not from her financial struggles, but from her sons, the very children she had sacrificed everything for. As they grew older, they seemed to forget the depth of their mother's sacrifices. They assumed that in her old age, Carmen needed little more than the basics. Without hesitation, they took the money she received, leaving her with only the essentials: bread, cheese, pasta, grains, milk, butter, fruits, and vegetables, just enough to get by, but never enough to thrive. Carmen, in her characteristic way, never voiced her pain. She bore the burden with grace, believing that her love for her children was enough to sustain her. Her needs felt secondary to the love she held for them, even as their visits became infrequent and brief. One day, when her eldest son, Victor, came to collect more money, Carmen couldn't help but let a little of her heartbreak slip through. "Buy something nice for the grandchildren," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of unspoken longing. Victor, already halfway out the door, nodded dismissively. "Sure, Mom," he replied, his mind elsewhere. The coldness of his response pierced Carmen's heart. She yearned for a connection, for even the smallest piece of the family she had devoted her life to. "Come inside, son," she implored, her eyes pleading. "You know how much I miss them. They're always so busy with school, but couldn't you bring them over sometimes? Just for a little while." Victor's impatience was palpable. "Maybe during the holidays, if we're not going anywhere," he said flatly. He planted a brief, indifferent kiss on her cheek and left without another word. Carmen stood at the door, watching him drive away, a familiar ache settling deep in her chest. The holidays often meant Victor and his family would be off on vacations abroad, leaving her even more isolated and alone. Her middle son, Pedro, was equally distant, though in his own way. Childless and utterly consumed by work, Pedro was always saving for a new home, for the future he was building. He visited rarely, always too busy to spend much time with his mother. And then there was Diego, her youngest, fresh out of university, eager to carve out his place in the world. He was unmarried, focused on his career, and constantly in need of financial help as he navigated the early stages of adulthood. All 3 of them seemed to have their own lives, their own pressing needs, while Carmen remained in the background, an afterthought, a memory of a time when they had needed her more. Each time they left, Carmen was left standing in the silence of her home, surrounded by memories of a life that had once been full of laughter and love. The ache of loneliness grew with each passing day, but still, she said nothing. She had spent her entire life giving to her children, And now, even in her old age, she couldn't bring herself to ask for more. She had been their rock, their constant, and even as they drifted away, she continued to love them with all that she had left. But deep down, she wondered if anyone would ever truly understand the sacrifices she had made, or if she would spend the rest of her days quietly fading into the background, forgotten by the very people she had given everything for. Her daughter, Sophia, was Carmen's glimmer of hope, the one bright light in an otherwise dim and lonely life. Sophia, who was studying abroad on a prestigious scholarship, rarely returned home, but she kept in touch through beautifully written letters. Those letters, filled with love and warmth, were Carmen's lifelines. She cherished them more than anything else in her life, clutching them as if they were a bridge to the daughter she adored. Sophia remained blissfully unaware of her brother's actions, as Carmen chose to keep her in the dark, unwilling to create any division among her children. To Carmen, the idea of keeping the family united no matter the cost to her own happiness was paramount. But underneath the surface, Carmen harbored a deep fear for the future. She dreaded the thought that Sophia might never return, that she would build a life abroad, fall in love, and marry, leaving Carmen behind in a life of solitude. The idea of losing her last connection to her children filled her with a quiet despair she never voiced. Day after day, she waited anxiously for a letter or a call, clinging to the hope that Sophia's love would somehow bring her back home. The absence of her daughter's presence left a void that deepened the loneliness already carved into her soul. Each sigh she let out carried the weight of years of quiet sacrifices that had left her in a state of aching isolation. Carmen had long resigned herself to the painful reality that she could no longer rely on her sons for support. They had drifted too far from her, their lives consumed by their own concerns and ambitions. Her only lifeline, her only source of hope, was Sophia. The letters that arrived, brimming with love and longing, were like a balm for Carmen's weary heart. "I miss you so much," Mom Sophia would write. "I can't wait to see you, the boys, and everyone back home." These heartfelt words were treasures to Carmen, and she carefully tucked each letter into a beautifully decorated box, preserving every piece of love and connection they represented. The box became her most cherished possession, a trove of affection that kept her tethered to her daughter's world. Her sons, however, were a different story entirely. Once a month, they would stop by, but not out of love or concern. They came for the money she received, leaving her with only the bare essentials to get by. On one such visit, her middle son, Pedro, arrived in a hurry, barely staying long enough to greet her. He snatched the money she had set aside for him and rushed off, eager to catch a flight for an important business meeting in another city. "Mom, don't worry," he assured her absent-mindedly as he hurried out the door. "My assistant will bring the groceries tomorrow morning." But Pedro, caught up in the whirlwind of his work, forgot to inform his assistant, leaving Carmen unknowingly abandoned. The next morning, Carmen waited patiently, her stomach knotted with a growing sense of unease. She sat by the window, glancing at the clock every few minutes, hoping that someone would show up. When no one came, she tried calling Pedro, but his phone was turned off. Desperation began to gnaw at her as she realized her other sons were unreachable as well. Victor was vacationing with his family by the seaside, and Diego had gone to a music festival with his friends. Carmen wandered through her small, quiet home, opening cupboards only to find them empty. No bread, no milk, nothing left to eat. Panic began to set in. She had never found herself in such a desperate situation before, and the realization that she had no one to turn to left her feeling utterly helpless. Carmen sat down at her kitchen table, staring at the empty space in front of her, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. The house, once filled with the laughter and life of her children, now felt like a prison of solitude. She had given everything she had for her family, and yet here she was, alone and forgotten, with nothing to sustain her but the fading memories of a time when love and warmth filled her days. For the first time in years, Carmen allowed herself to feel the full weight of her loneliness. She had always been strong, always held everything together for the sake of her children. But now, with no food in the house and no one to rely on, she felt like she was crumbling under the pressure of it all. For a brief moment, Carmen considered the possibility of seeking help from her neighbor. But then she remembered that her neighbor had gone to visit her own children and wouldn't be home for days. The weight of her isolation pressed down on her, and she realized that, at that moment, she was utterly alone. Her pride, though bruised, could not keep her from facing the reality of her situation. With no other options, she made the difficult decision to walk to the town square near the market. She moved slowly, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what she would have to do. As she reached the square, Carmen timidly approached strangers, her voice barely above a whisper, as she asked if they could spare enough to help her buy a loaf of bread. Each plea felt like a stone tied to her soul, dragging her deeper into the shame of her circumstances. The burning humiliation flushed her cheeks as she watched people hurry past, too wrapped up in their own lives to notice her quiet desperation. Most didn't even acknowledge her existence, their eyes glazed over with indifference as they continued on their way. Just as Carmen was about to lose all hope, she heard the low hum of an engine and looked up to see a sleek, expensive Jeep pulling up in front of her. Startled, she took a step back, unsure of what to expect. Her heart raced as the door swung open and a young man, impeccably dressed in designer clothes and wearing dark sunglasses, stepped out with an expression of shock on his face. "Senora Martinez," he exclaimed, his voice filled with disbelief. "I can't believe it's you." Carmen blinked in confusion. How did this well-dressed stranger know her name? Her mind scrambled for answers until the man removed his sunglasses, revealing a face she hadn't seen in years but could never forget. "It's me," Manuel, he said, a warm smile spreading across his face. The moment he spoke, recognition washed over her like a flood. "Manuel," my dear Carmen whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Tears welled up in her eyes, and before she could stop them, they spilled down her weathered cheeks. "Look at you, how you've grown," she marveled, unable to believe the transformation in the boy she once knew. Without hesitation, Manuel wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a comforting embrace. His presence felt like a lifeline, a wave of relief that washed away some of the despair that had clung to her heart. As he pulled back slightly, he looked down and noticed the empty cloth bag hanging loosely in her hands. "What are you doing here, Senora?" Manuel asked gently, concern etched into his features. Carmen opened her mouth to answer, but the words refused to come. The shame of begging for food in the town square was too heavy, too overwhelming to admit. She could only stand there, her eyes cast downward, her hands trembling as she gripped the bag. Sensing her discomfort, Manuel glanced around and quickly pieced together what had happened. His voice softened as he guessed. "You were probably headed to the market for groceries, weren't you? Come on, let's go together. I'll help you get everything you need, and I'll drive you home so you don't have to carry anything." Carmen looked up at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. In that moment, the overwhelming despair that had consumed her began to lift, replaced by the warmth of Manuel's unexpected kindness. She hadn't seen him in so many years, and yet here he was, offering her the help she so desperately needed without a hint of judgment. With a nod, she allowed herself to accept his offer, feeling the heavy burden of loneliness lighten as they walked toward the market together. Manuel's presence beside her, his genuine care, brought a flicker of hope back into her heart. For the first time in a long while, Carmen felt like she wasn't entirely alone in the world. With a gentle yet firm grasp, Manuel took Carmen's arm, guiding her through the bustling market. Each step weighed heavy on Carmen's heart, not just from the strain of her circumstances, but from the deep embarrassment of relying on someone she had once cared for as a child. She searched desperately for the right words to stop him without hurting his feelings. "Manuel, please forgive me," she whispered, her voice tinged with shame. I just realized I left my wallet at home. Manuel didn't miss a beat. He continued walking beside her, his pace unwavering. Don't worry about it, Sonora. I've got everything covered, he reassured her with a smile, his tone light and warm. Carmen's heart sank further. The thought of accepting his help made her feel uneasy. But Manuel, she began, her voice trembling with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. I'll feel so uncomfortable taking your money. At this, Manuel stopped walking and turned to face her, his eyes filled with kindness and sincerity. Sonora Martinez, he said gently, how can you even think that? Do you remember all you did for me? You treated me like your own son, feeding me every day, making sure I was never hungry. You gave me so much when I had nothing. And now, after everything, you won't let me do this small thing for you. Carmen felt a lump form in her throat as tears welled up in her eyes. She fumbled in her pocket for a handkerchief, dabbing at her tears as she pressed her hands to her chest. You're such a good, grateful boy, she whispered, her voice full of emotion. She had always known, deep down, that Manuel would grow up to be someone special, and seeing it now filled her with an overwhelming sense of pride and relief. Come on, Manuel urged softly, taking her elbow again. Let's get everything we need, and then I'll drive you home. No more worrying, okay? As they moved through the crowded market together, Manuel guided her with the utmost care. He warned her about uneven steps, gently steadied her on small slopes, and made sure she was safe. They walked down rows of colorful produce, with Manuel insisting on buying only the very best for her. He filled their bags with fresh, vibrant fruits and vegetables, high-quality meats, and cheeses, anything he thought she might enjoy. Look, the strawberries are ripe already, Manuel said with a grin, holding up a basket of plump, juicy berries. I remember how much you love them. Carmen hesitated, her eyes drifting to the price tag. But Manuel, they're so expensive, she protested softly, feeling overwhelmed by his generosity. Nonsense, Manuel said with a dismissive wave of his hand. It doesn't matter. I'm more than happy to get you what you love. It's the least I can do. Carmen looked at him with tear-filled eyes, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief coursing through her. She had always believed in the goodness of people, but life had worn her down. Yet here was Manuel, standing before her as proof that her kindness had not been in vain. The weight of her loneliness and the fear of her situation began to lift, replaced by a warmth she hadn't felt in years, a feeling of being seen, valued, and cared for. As they finished their shopping and made their way back to the Jeep, Carmen couldn't help but glance over at Manuel with a renewed sense of hope. She realized that even in the darkest of times, the seeds of kindness she had planted years ago were now blossoming into something beautiful. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps there were still brighter days ahead. With the bags brimming with groceries, Manuel swiftly and confidently carried everything to his Jeep, his movements easy and sure. Carmen followed as best she could, her steps slower, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, her heart felt light. A warm sense of comfort spread through her, as if the heavy burdens of her lonely life had been gently lifted from her shoulders. When they finally reached the Jeep, Manuel effortlessly loaded the groceries into the back and then turned to help Carmen into the passenger seat, his actions tender and careful. As Manuel expertly navigated the familiar streets of the city, Carmen sat quietly beside him, her heart overflowing with gratitude and admiration for this young man she had once cared for. For the first time in so long, she felt truly seen, cared for, cherished, and remembered. Do you remember where I live? Carmen asked softly, her voice carrying the uncertainty of someone who had been overlooked and forgotten too many times. Of course, Sonora Martinez, Manuel replied without a moment's hesitation. I lived next to you for more than 10 years. His voice held a subtle sadness, tinged with the weight of old memories that lingered between them. Carmen nodded slowly, her mind drifting back to those days. Manuel had been the son of her neighbors, the family that lived just across the street. But theirs had not been a happy home. The air around their house often carried the sharp, bitter smell of alcohol, followed by the angry echoes of arguments that spilled out into the night. Manuel had been caught in the middle of it all, suffering quietly, his young heart bearing the brunt of his father's explosive temper. When the storm of rage broke, the boy would run from the chaos, seeking refuge at Carmen's home, where the warmth of her kitchen and the company of her children offered him a temporary escape. She remembered how Manuel would spend hours at her house, playing with her children, though he was different from them in many ways. While Victor, Pedro, and Diego preferred to be outside, running through the yard and immersed in their games, Manuel would slip inside, always eager to lend a hand. Whether it was setting the table or stirring a pot, he was there, thoughtful and willing. Unlike her own sons, who often needed to be asked multiple times to help with chores, Manuel never hesitated. He was attentive and grateful for even the smallest acts of kindness, a boy who seemed to appreciate every moment of peace he could find away from his troubled home. Sophia, too, had enjoyed his company, often joining him in their quiet indoor activities while the others played outside. Senora Martinez, Manuel's voice gently interrupted her reverie, pulling her back to the present. "How is Sophia? Has she married yet?" Carmen smiled wistfully at the mention of her daughter. "No, not yet," she replied, her voice softening with fondness. "She's studying abroad, working hard to finish her degree. She writes to me often, her letters are such a comfort. But no marriage yet." Manuel nodded thoughtfully, a small smile playing on his lips. "I'm not surprised," he said warmly. "Sophia was always so focused, so determined. I'm sure she'll achieve great things." Carmen's heart swelled with pride as she thought of her daughter's accomplishments. "Yes, she's always been driven," she agreed. "She's doing well, but I do miss her terribly. I worry sometimes that she might stay abroad, that I might not see her as much as I'd like." Manuel reached over and gently patted Carmen's hand. "I'm sure she'll come back to you, Senora. Family is important to her, I know it is. And if she's anything like you, she'll never forget where she came from." Carmen's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of gratitude and hope. She squeezed Manuel's hand in return, feeling the warmth of his kindness seep into her heart. "Thank you, Manuel," she whispered. "You've always had a good heart." As they continued their journey, Carmen allowed herself to bask in the comfort of the moment, knowing that even in her darkest times, there were still people who cared, people like Manuel, who had not forgotten the love she had once given. Carmen glanced over at Manuel as he drove, noticing how his eyes remained fixed on the road, but his posture betrayed a quiet anticipation. He seemed to be waiting, hoping for some news about Sophia. She felt the weight of his silent question, and after a pause, she decided to share what she knew. "She's studying abroad," Carmen said, her voice tinged with pride. "She applied to university all on her own and earned a scholarship." A soft smile spread across Manuel's face, and he whispered almost to himself, "I always knew she had it in her." Carmen nodded, watching him closely now. With his sunglasses removed, she could see his eyes more clearly, those familiar hazel eyes that had once been so full of youthful energy and mischief. Now, though, they seemed clouded, as if he were lost in thought, drifting back to the past. His hand moved to the radio, and a retro melody began to fill the car, the soothing notes wrapping around them like a comforting embrace. As the music played, Carmen closed her eyes and allowed it to transport her back in time. She could see Manuel as a boy once more, tall for his age, with a slight awkwardness in his movements. His unruly black hair always had that one stubborn tuft at the back that refused to lie flat, no matter how much he tried to tame it. His hazel eyes, though often filled with a lively spark, had always carried a weight, a sadness that no child should ever bear. She remembered the bruises that sometimes marked his skin, the ones he would try to hide behind his quiet smile. The entire neighborhood had known about the fights and the shouting that erupted from his home, but no one dared to speak of it openly. Manuel had endured so much pain, yet he had never let it harden him. He had grown into a kind, caring man, the same thoughtful soul who had found comfort in her kitchen all those years ago. Carmen couldn't help but feel a deep affection for him, a love that had only deepened over time. He was as much a son to her as her own boys, and now, seeing him here, helping her in her time of need, filled her with a sense of gratitude that was difficult to put into words. As they continued down the road, Carmen let herself drift in and out of the past, the soothing music mingling with her memories. She could still picture the lively games her sons and Manuel had played together: tag, hide and seek, and all the other childhood adventures that filled their days with laughter. Her boys had never turned him away, always welcoming him into their world with open arms. But despite the fun they had outside, Manuel had always seemed to find the most solace inside the house, in the warmth of Carmen's kitchen. The kitchen had become his sanctuary, a place where he felt safe and cherished. Sitting quietly beside her as she prepared meals brought him a sense of peace. He took pride in helping her, whether it was rolling out dough for pies with careful precision, chopping vegetables for the soup with steady hands, or mashing the boiled potatoes into a smooth, creamy puree. In those moments, Carmen knew that he felt most connected to her, that the simple acts of cooking and working together brought him a sense of belonging that he couldn't find anywhere else. Carmen's heart swelled with affection as she thought about those days. She had seen the pain Manuel carried with him, but she had also seen the strength and resilience that lay beneath it. And now, as they made their way back to her home, she realized just how much she had missed those quiet moments with him. His presence beside her brought back the warmth of those long-ago days, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to simply enjoy the moment, grateful for the kindness and love that still existed in her world. Sofia had always felt a magnetic pull toward the kitchen. It was more than just the warmth of the hearth or the delicious smells of her mother's cooking. There was a rhythm there, a comforting cadence in the way her mother moved about, preparing meals with the care and love that only Carmen could give. But even more than that, it was the easy companionship she had developed with Manuel that kept her lingering there. From the very beginning, something unspoken blossomed between them, a bond that didn't need words to be understood. Their connection was instinctive, deep, and unbreakable, as though they communicated on a level that transcended mere conversation. This mutual understanding fascinated them both, and it kept them close in ways that words could never explain. Manuel, with his boundless curiosity, was always searching for new knowledge. He was captivated by the mysteries of the stars and could spend hours marveling at the vastness of the universe, lost in the wonders of astronomy. His knowledge of European capitals was astonishing for someone his age, and he delighted in sharing the random, intriguing facts he had learned, whether from school or from old newspapers he'd scavenged from the neighbors' trash bins. To Sonora Torres, this curious boy was a bright light, full of life and wonder, always eager to soak up everything the world had to offer. But despite the brightness Manuel brought into their lives, the next morning brought no change to Carmen's world. Her husband remained resolute in his stance, his heart hardened and unwilling to bend. And Sofia, too, remained locked away in her room, lost in a world of her own emotions. From the window, Carmen caught sight of Manuel, his pale face filled with hope, silently pleading for some form of comfort or assurance. Yet with a heavy heart, Carmen could only shake her head in sorrow. Manuel, with a small, understanding nod, retreated back to his house, his hope dashed. A week passed in painful silence, and then, without warning, Manuel was gone. He left behind only a short, bittersweet letter in Carmen's mailbox, a quiet farewell that carried the weight of all the things left unsaid. "I'm truly sorry it ended up this way, Mrs. Martinez. If I could change anything, I would. Please send my warmest regards to Sofia. Your kindness will stay with me forever." You were the brightest part of my life. Sincerely, Manuel." As Carmen read Manuel's letter, her emotions overwhelmed her, and she broke down into tears. She missed him terribly, his boundless energy, his infectious laughter, and the captivating stories that had once brightened every corner of her home. Without Manuel, life felt emptier, duller, as though the vibrancy of her days had faded with his departure. When Sofia entered the kitchen, Carmen quietly handed her the letter, unable to find the words to express her grief. Without a word, Sofia embraced her mother tightly, tears streaming down her own cheeks as the weight of loss settled between them. They both understood the harsh reality. They couldn't change what had happened. All they could do was accept it, even if it tore at their hearts. Though heartbroken, Sofia found solace in her studies. Manuel's absence sparked something within her, driving her to immerse herself in her education with newfound determination. His departure became her motivation, pushing her to pursue a dream she had never dared to consider before studying at a prestigious university abroad. The thought of following in Manuel's footsteps gave her purpose, and his memory became the beacon that guided her toward success. Every late-night study session, every exam, every achievement was fueled by the thought of him, by the hope that one day she might make him proud. In time, Sofia achieved the dreams she had clung to so tightly, the ones that had consumed her every waking moment. Watching her daughter soar filled Carmen's heart with a pride so fierce it almost hurt. Yet, as joyful as it was, the act of letting Sofia go was tinged with an undeniable sadness. Sofia had been her beacon, the one person Carmen had adored with such an overwhelming love that it sometimes left her breathless with fear. It was a love that ran so deep, it terrified her. What would life be without her shining star? Her sons, however, felt more like distant echoes in her life, as if they were merely passing through without truly touching her heart. They seemed unreachable, like ghosts of what could have been. Carmen often found herself lost in the endless what-ifs, haunted by the notion that if her husband had been more present, more emotionally engaged, perhaps her boys would have turned out differently. If only he had taken the time to nurture a real bond with them, maybe they would have grown up with a deeper sense of compassion, a stronger connection to the world she lived in. But life, relentless and unforgiving, moved on despite her regrets, dragging her along in its wake. With a heavy sigh, Carmen forced herself to return to the present. The past, unchangeable and relentless, was carved into her memory like stone, unyielding and irreversible. As her eyes drifted toward the window, she noticed the familiar sight of Manuel's car pulling up. He parked just as he always had, moving with that same quiet elegance that had stayed with him throughout the years. As he stepped out, Carmen felt a swell of emotion rise in her chest. He walked toward her with the calm assurance of someone who had always belonged in her life. Manuel helped her from the car, his hands steady and gentle, and then effortlessly retrieved the grocery bags from the trunk. Watching him, Carmen's heart filled with a deep nostalgia that nearly overwhelmed her. She hurried to unlock the door, her hands trembling slightly in her eagerness to welcome him back into her world. As Manuel crossed the threshold into the familiar hallway, his eyes lingered on every detail. He breathed deeply, as if inhaling the essence of the memories that filled the space. "Nothing has changed," he murmured, his voice laced with a quiet longing. "Even the scent. That sweet fragrance of cherry blossoms. It stayed with me. Even in my dreams," his words carried a weight of nostalgia that Carmen felt in her bones, a longing for a time that seemed forever out of reach. "I've missed you too," Carmen whispered, her voice thick with unspoken emotion. Manuel carried the groceries into the kitchen, his body language suggesting he might slip away after the task was done, but Carmen was not having it. With a gentle yet firm insistence, she smiled and said, "You're not leaving without tasting my pancakes. I remember how much you loved them." A soft, warm laugh escaped Manuel, and he settled into a chair at the table. "All right, Senora Martinez," he said with a teasing smile, "I'm in no hurry." As Carmen unpacked the groceries and began to prepare the ingredients, she glanced over her shoulder at him, her eyes filled with a mix of affection and curiosity. "So tell me, how have you been? What's been keeping you busy these days?" she asked, her voice laced with genuine warmth. A broad smile spread across Manuel's face, lighting up his features with a happiness that seemed to radiate from within. "Life has treated me well," he said with a touch of contentment. "I'm doing what I love, and I couldn't ask for more." And in that quiet kitchen, amidst the familiar sounds and smells of home, Carmen felt a fleeting moment of peace, a small reminder that while the past could not be changed, the present still held the promise of connection and love. "And what might that be?" Carmen asked, reaching for a pink mixing bowl from the cupboard. Manuel's eyes twinkled with pride as he confessed, "I've become a chef." Carmen's face lit up with delight. "Oh, I always knew you had a passion for cooking," she exclaimed, casting a joyful glance his way. Manuel nodded, his expression softening with the memory. "Yes, it was your kitchen that sparked it all. You inspired me, Sonora Martinez. It was here, rolling out dough and chopping vegetables beside you, that I realized what I was meant to do." Carmen felt warmth flood her chest, a deep sense of satisfaction knowing she had played a part in his journey. As she cracked eggs into the bowl and whisked them together with sugar, she couldn't help but smile at the thought of cooking for him once more. "And not to brag," Manuel added with a playful laugh, "but I'm not just any chef, I'm a head chef now." "Is that so?" Carmen asked, her smile widening. "Yes," Manuel confirmed. "I'm working at the most popular restaurant in town. It's been a dream come true. I've been incredibly fortunate." Hearing this, Carmen's heart swelled with pride. As she continued preparing the batter, she couldn't help but marvel at how far Manuel had come. From the boy who once found comfort in her kitchen, to a man who had carved out a place for himself in the world, his success felt like a shared victory, one that brought her immense joy and a bittersweet sense of closure. For a moment, Carmen paused in her work, her hands still covered in flour. She stepped over to Manuel and gently placed her hand on his shoulder. Her voice, thick with emotion, quivered as she said, "I'm so proud of you, Manuel." Tears welled up in her eyes, and though she tried to blink them away, Manuel noticed. He stood, enveloping her in a warm, reassuring embrace. "You've been worried about me all this time, haven't you?" he whispered, his voice tender. "But now you can rest easy, knowing that I've found my way." Carmen nodded softly, a small smile breaking through the tears. "Yes, now my heart can be at peace." She returned to the stove, picking up where she left off, pouring batter into the frying pan with practiced ease. As the pancakes began to sizzle, she looked over her shoulder at him, a playful glint in her eyes. "I hope becoming the best chef in town hasn't spoiled your love for my pancakes," she teased. Manuel chuckled, the sound a gentle reminder of days gone by. "Never," he assured her, his tone light but sincere. "Especially if they come with that homemade strawberry jam of yours." But as Carmen turned to smile at him, she noticed a shadow pass over his face. His gaze had drifted toward the portrait of Sophia hanging on the wall, and in his eyes she could see the weight of unspoken sorrow. Her heart ached for him, and she knew that some wounds took longer to heal than others. "She missed you terribly," Manuel, Carmen admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Manuel lowered his head, his shoulders sagging with regret. "I'm sorry," he said, his words heavy with remorse. "I'm sorry things turned out the way they did. I still feel ashamed, like I failed both of you." Carmen, flipping the pancake with a practiced hand, glanced at him with understanding. "You have nothing to be ashamed of," she said firmly, shaking her head. "I've never blamed you for anything, Sophia. She was young, and she acted on impulse. She didn't fully grasp the consequences." Manuel sighed deeply, the sound filled with the weight of years of pent-up emotion. The truth is, his voice trailed off, and in that instant, a realization struck Carmen like a bolt of lightning. "You loved her, didn't you?" she exclaimed, her eyes widening with sudden clarity. Manuel's silence spoke volumes, but then he nodded, his voice soft and full of old feelings. "Yes, I did," he confessed. "I loved her more than anything. I was planning to wait until she turned 18, and then I was going to ask for her hand in marriage." Carmen's breath caught in her throat, disbelief mingling with a strange sense of understanding. "Is it true, Manuel?" she asked, almost afraid to believe it. "It's true," Manuel replied, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "But time can change so much. 4 years is a long time. Sofia could have moved on, found someone else. Back then, she was just a girl, and I didn't want to rush her into anything." Carmen nodded, her heart aching for the lost possibilities. "I understand," she said softly. "But you believed you were meant to be together." "I did," Manuel said, his voice filled with the quiet conviction of someone who had held on to that belief for far too long. "I thought we had a future. I planned to finish school, find a good job, and build a life for us." Carmen offered him a warm smile, full of pride and affection. "Well, you've certainly succeeded in that, haven't you?" But Manuel didn't share in her smile. His gaze remained downcast, and a deep sigh escaped him. "I never started a family," though he admitted quietly, his voice almost a whisper. The room fell into a gentle silence, the only sound the soft sizzling of the pancakes. Carmen sensed that there was more he wanted to say, something heavy weighing on his heart, something important that had been left unspoken for too long. She waited, giving him the space he needed, knowing that whatever it was, it mattered deeply. Manuel finally broke the silence with a confession that had weighed on him for years. "I still love Sofia," he admitted softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I could never forget her. Every night I try to picture what she's like now, wondering if she's changed or if she's the same girl I fell in love with." Carmen, feeling the weight of his words, removed the last pancake from the pan and switched off the stove. She approached him quietly, her heart aching for him. Placing a plate of warm pancakes and a bowl of strawberry jam in front of him, she gently said, "Oh, my poor boy." She poured him a cup of coffee and sat down beside him, offering a comforting presence in the midst of his vulnerability. But before Manuel could even take a proper bite, the doorbell rang, interrupting the quiet moment. Carmen quickly rose and made her way to the hallway, her mind still spinning from all that had transpired. As she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Standing on the doorstep, just as vibrant and alive as ever, was Sofia. "Mom, thank God you're okay," Sofia exclaimed, rushing forward to embrace her mother tightly. Carmen, still reeling from the day's events, found herself overwhelmed by yet another surprise. "What are you doing here, dear?" she asked, her voice filled with shock and disbelief. The day had been full of unexpected turns, and she had barely had time to process the first surprise reuniting with Manuel. Now, seeing her daughter standing on the doorstep felt like a dream she hadn't dared to hope for. "I came to see you, of course," Sofia replied with a hint of indignation, brushing her bangs away from her face. "Mom, can I at least come inside?" Feeling a little embarrassed for leaving her daughter at the doorstep, Carmen stepped aside and let her in. She led Sofia into the hallway, her mind racing as she tried to process everything that had happened. As they entered the kitchen, Carmen's eyes flickered toward Manuel, who was still seated at the table, quietly waiting. The sight of her daughter and Manuel in the same room, after all these years, felt surreal. Sofia took in her surroundings, the familiar warmth of her childhood home washing over her. But her nostalgia was quickly replaced by anger as she remembered what she had discovered earlier. "I never thought my brothers could be so low, vile, and dishonest," she blurted out, throwing her bag onto the floor with frustration. Carmen's heart sank, and she lowered her gaze, a mix of shame and sadness swirling within her. "You know everything?" she asked in a subdued voice, fearing the answer. "Thank God, yes," Sophia replied with exasperation as she unbuttoned her jacket and hung it on a nearby hook. "Early this morning I was beside myself with worry. I had this strange, overwhelming anxiety that wouldn't leave me alone. I called you over and over, but you didn't pick up, so I called Pedro. And that's when he slipped up. He let it out he had forgotten to leave groceries for you. He tried to cover it up, swearing he'd get his assistant on it right away. But I didn't trust him anymore. I made him transfer your savings to me along with the money for a ticket. He couldn't refuse. And I got on the next flight. I was terrified, thinking you might be on the brink of despair, or worse, starving." Carmen listened, her heart heavy with the weight of her daughter's words. She had known her sons were becoming more distant, but hearing Sophia's anger and concern made it all the more real. She realized how much her children's actions had affected her and how deeply Sophia cared, even from afar. Manuel, who had been silently watching the reunion, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his emotions swirling just as intensely as Carmen's and Sophia's. The years had passed, but some things like love, regret, and family never truly faded. As Sophia spoke, her hands moved with desperate gestures, her worry visible in every frantic motion. She tried repeatedly to hug her mother, her anxiety pouring out through her words and actions. Carmen, caught in the whirlwind of her daughter's emotions, felt her own heart swell with a complex blend of feelings: confusion, pride, shame, and a deep, overwhelming joy. She had forgotten her phone on the bedside table that morning, distracted by the lack of groceries and money, and hadn't realized how much distress her silence had caused. "You're so brave," Sophia Carmen said, finally pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. She quickly added, wanting to soothe her daughter's fears, "I'm fine, truly. I had help." At this, Carmen hesitated, the words catching in her throat. After a brief pause, she gathered her courage and continued, "I was helped by Manuel." The name struck Sophia like a bolt of lightning. Her face turned pale as she stammered, "What did you say?" "Manuel." That Manuel. When Carmen nodded, confirming her words, Sophia swayed as if the ground beneath her had shifted. Carmen suddenly realized they were still standing in the narrow hallway, emotions running high. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "why are we standing here in the hallway? Let's go to the kitchen. He's still there." Upon hearing this, Sophia's hands flew to her purse, rummaging frantically for a mirror and lipstick. Carmen couldn't help but smile at the sight of her daughter's sudden vanity. "You look beautiful just as you are," she reassured her softly. Sophia gave a nervous nod, took a deep breath, and followed her mother into the kitchen. As they entered, Manuel looked up from his seat, and the moment his eyes fell on Sophia, he stood up in astonishment. Time seemed to stand still as they took in each other's presence, as if all the years apart had been nothing but a fleeting moment. Sophia was even more radiant than he remembered, her beauty now carrying a maturity that only deepened his admiration for her. She, too, gazed at him in silence, her heart racing as memories flooded back. Then, as if a dam had broken, the tension melted away, and the two rushed into each other's arms, holding on tightly, unwilling to let go. "I missed you so much," Manuel whispered, his voice filled with the quiet ache of all the years that had passed without her. Sophia's grip on him tightened, and she whispered back, "I missed you too, Manuel. More than you'll ever know." The kitchen, once filled with the simple sounds of cooking, now held a warmth that came not just from the stove, but from the reunion of two souls who had longed for this moment. Carmen watched them with a bittersweet smile, feeling the weight of the past lift slightly as she witnessed the beginning of what could be a new chapter for them both. "I missed you too," Sophia said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "Please forgive me for everything." Manuel gently ran his hand through her hair, a tender gesture that spoke volumes. "And forgive me for leaving," he replied, his voice heavy with regret, the weight of past choices lingering in his words. Sophia felt her emotions building up inside her, the familiar sting of tears threatening to spill over. But just as she was about to break, Carmen stepped in with a cheerful tone. "Why are you two just standing there? Come on, sit down. The pancakes have already cooled off completely," she said, attempting to lift the mood and bring some lightness back into the room. They sat down at the table, a quiet hush falling over them. The silence was thick with unspoken words, nervous energy hanging in the air. But soon enough, Manuel began to share stories of his work, and Sophia talked about her studies, the conversation flowing more easily with each passing moment. Carmen watched them, feeling as though the years of separation had melted away, as if everything had finally come full circle. She felt a newfound strength and joy as she expertly flipped more pancakes, basking in the warmth of the moment. Yet beneath the surface, one thought gnawed at Carmen's heart. Sophia's earlier outburst replayed in her mind like a broken record. "I never thought my brothers could be so low, so mean, and dishonest." The bitterness in her daughter's voice echoed again and again, stirring up old anxieties. It seemed Sophia could sense her mother's unease. In the middle of her story, she abruptly stopped and turned her concerned gaze toward Carmen. "Mom," she asked anxiously, "how long have they been taking your money?" Carmen froze, her hands trembling slightly as she fumbled with the plates. She didn't want to answer, didn't want to burden her daughter with the truth. But Sophia was insistent. "Tell it as it is, Mom. Don't protect them." With a reluctant sigh, Carmen finally gave in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Almost 4 years. Since you left." What Sophia shot up from her seat, her face flushed with anger, as if she was ready to march out and confront her brothers that very moment. But when she caught sight of Manuel's concerned and puzzled expression, she forced herself to calm down, sinking back into her chair. "But Mom, how could you let this happen? Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Carmen avoided her daughter's gaze, her hands busy clearing the dishes from the table, as if that task alone could shield her from the intensity of Sophia's emotions. I didn't want to worry you," she murmured. "And I didn't want to cause any more fights between you and your brothers." "But they didn't deserve your silence." Mom. Sophia couldn't contain her frustration, her voice rising again. She stood up once more, pacing the room like a caged animal, her mind racing with thoughts of betrayal and hurt. How could they do this to their own mother? Manuel sat quietly, observing the exchange with a troubled expression. He didn't want to interfere in what was clearly a family matter, but the tension in the room weighed heavily on him. He could see the pain etched in both women's faces, the years of unresolved hurt bubbling to the surface in that small kitchen. Sophia's pacing slowed and she finally stopped, taking a deep breath. She looked at her mother with a mixture of anger and concern. "This has to stop, Mom. They can't keep doing this to you. I'm here now, and I'll make sure things change." Carmen, feeling both relief and a twinge of guilt, nodded silently. She had tried to protect her children from conflict, but in the process, she had let herself suffer in silence. Now, with Sophia back and Manuel by her side, she felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things would finally change for the better. "I really didn't need anything. I had enough with the groceries they bought for me," Carmen said, trying to defend her sons, her voice laced with guilt. "Mom, don't you see? This isn't normal," Sophia exclaimed, her frustration bubbling over as she struggled to make her mother understand. At this point, Manuel, who had been quietly absorbing the tense exchange, decided it was time to intervene. "I'm the only one here who doesn't understand what's going on," he said, his eyes darting between the two women, seeking answers. Sophia sighed and sat back down at the table, her anger momentarily tempered by the need to explain. My heartless brothers have been taking Mom's savings for 4 years. In exchange, they've been leaving her groceries, like some twisted trade-off. Manuel's eyes widened in disbelief, his expression shifting from confusion to fury. "What? That's downright despicable," he burst out, his outrage mirroring Sophia's earlier anger. "Exactly," Sophia agreed, her voice sharp with indignation. "I had no idea about any of this. Mom, did they also take my money?" Carmen's face flushed with embarrassment, and her silence spoke louder than any words could. Sophia didn't need an answer to know the truth. Those she started, but stopped herself, not wanting to upset her already weary mother further. Manuel, unable to contain his anger, stood up abruptly. "I'm going to them right now. This cannot go on. They need to understand that treating their own mother like this is absolutely unacceptable." But before he could storm out, Carmen gently took his hand, guiding him back into his seat. "Manuel, none of them are in town right now," she said softly, her eyes filled with sadness. "That's why I ended up in the market square, trying to beg for bread from passersby." Her confession hit them both like a punch to the gut. The young people exchanged a look of shared pain and anger, the weight of the situation settling heavily on their shoulders. "Oh, Mom," Sophia whispered, her voice thick with sympathy, tears welling up in her eyes. "How could you let it get this far?" Manuel, still seething but now filled with deep sorrow, gently scolded, "Senora Martinez, why didn't you tell us right away? We would have helped you." "I couldn't," Carmen admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I was too ashamed. I didn't want anyone to know how bad things had gotten. I didn't want to be a burden." Her words cut through the room like a knife, leaving Sophia and Manuel struggling to comprehend the depth of her suffering. Carmen had always been their rock, the strong, selfless woman who had given everything for her family. To hear her admit to such vulnerability was almost unbearable. They had both been too far removed, too caught up in their own lives to see how deeply she had been hurting. But now, with the truth out in the open, there was no going back. "I swear this won't happen again," Manuel said firmly, determination etched into his voice. Sophia nodded in agreement, her own resolve clear in her expression. Carmen sat quietly, torn between gratitude for the care and concern of these two dear souls and the deep, aching sadness that filled her heart whenever she thought of her son's betrayal. Carmen couldn't shake the feeling that somehow this was her fault. Perhaps she hadn't done enough to teach her sons about kindness, compassion, and family values. Should she have been more diligent in setting an example? But then, she couldn't remember a time when she had been cruel or unkind to anyone. So where had things gone wrong? As Carmen's thoughts swirled, Sophia unexpectedly approached her and gently hugged her shoulders. "Mom, sit down. There's something important I need to talk to you about," she said softly, her tone reassuring. Carmen sat down as instructed, though her mind raced with uncertainty. What could Sophia possibly want to say? Sophia sat beside her mother, her voice calm and gentle. "Mom, at my university I'm highly valued. I'm almost done with my degree, and they already trust me enough to let me give lectures to the freshmen. So, as soon as I get my diploma, I'll become an assistant at the department and continue my studies to become a professor." Hearing this, Carmen's heart skipped a beat. Her daughter's success filled her with immense pride, but at the same time, a deep sadness settled over her. The reality of her fears hit her hard. Sophia would stay abroad, pursuing her career, and Carmen would be left alone in her old age, with only memories to keep her company. Sophia quickly noticed the shift in her mother's expression and immediately reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Mom, don't worry. I haven't finished yet," she said, her voice full of warmth. "I want to take you with me." Carmen's eyes widened in surprise. "Take me with you? But Sophia, how can I move? "What's stopping you, dear?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Sophia smiled, a determined look in her eyes. "Mom, nothing is stopping you. I want you to come live with me. You don't need to stay here, struggling alone. You can be by my side, and we can take care of each other. You deserve to be happy, Mom, and I want to make sure you're not lonely." Carmen was overwhelmed by the offer, tears welling up in her eyes as she processed her daughter's words. The thought of leaving behind the place she had called home for so long was daunting, but the idea of being with Sophia, of not spending her days in isolation, brought a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. "But your life, your studies," Carmen began, her voice trembling. Sophia shook her head, cutting her off gently. "Mom, you've sacrificed so much for all of us. Now it's my turn to be there for you. I'll make sure everything works out. Please just think about it." Carmen looked at her daughter, seeing the same determination in her eyes that had driven her to succeed. For the first time in a long while, Carmen allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't filled with loneliness, and slowly, she began to nod. "All right, Sophia, I'll think about it." Manuel, who had been quietly listening to their conversation, smiled warmly at both women. "That sounds like a wonderful plan," he said softly. "You both deserve to be happy together." Carmen's gaze wandered around the familiar kitchen, her eyes lingering on the worn countertops and the little trinkets that had accumulated over 40 years. Every corner of this house held a memory, a piece of her life. "I've grown so accustomed to this place," she murmured softly, her voice tinged with melancholy. "I've lived here for so long. It's all I know." Sophia nodded, understanding the depth of her mother's attachment. "I know, Mom, but you're getting older, and you need proper care. Who will look after you here? My brothers have already shown that they're not capable of it. If you sell this house, you could buy a beautiful place near me." Carmen felt the weight of her daughter's words pressing against her heart. Though she had never imagined leaving this home, there was something undeniably true in what Sophia was saying. A small spark of desire, a yearning for change, began to flicker within her. How strange. "I've never thought about moving before," she reflected inwardly, surprised by the unfamiliar feeling creeping in. And besides, Sophia added, her tone brightening, "after selling the house, you'd have extra money. You could even go on a trip, Mom, see the world." Carmen's mind whirled at the thought. "But I've never traveled anywhere," she admitted, her voice hesitant. "I wouldn't even know how. I'm not sure I'd dare to do such a thing." Manuel, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up, his voice filled with warmth. "I'll take you wherever you want to go, Senora Martinez, and I won't take a cent from you." Both women turned to him, their expressions a mix of surprise and admiration. His offer was so sincere, so generous, that it touched them both deeply. Before they could respond, Manuel added, "And Sophia, you'll join us, won't you?" Sophia's smile grew, tears of emotion welling up in her eyes again. "With pleasure," she replied softly, the words carrying the weight of all the years they had been apart. The connection between them was palpable. As they looked into each other's eyes, Carmen felt something she hadn't felt in years, the unmistakable presence of love. The bond that had been forged between them in childhood hadn't faded with time, it had only deepened. They still cared for each other, still understood each other in a way that transcended words. But just as Carmen allowed herself to feel hopeful, an unpleasant thought clouded her mind. "What about the boys?" she murmured, her voice barely audible. "They won't let me go." Sophia squeezed her mother's hand gently, her grip firm and reassuring. "They'll have to accept it, Mom," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "You've spent enough time worrying about them. Now, it's time to think about yourself." Manuel nodded in agreement, his gaze softening as he looked at Carmen. "You've given so much to everyone else. Let us take care of you now." Carmen, feeling the warmth of her daughter's hand and the support of Manuel, allowed herself to imagine a different life, a life filled with new possibilities, love, and adventure. Maybe, just maybe, it was time for her to embrace that change. 3 months later, despite her son's protests and resistance, Carmen made the bold decision to move in with her daughter. Sophia had helped her find and purchase a small, cozy house nestled near the edge of a tranquil forest, with a stunning view of a serene lake. It was a peaceful retreat, far removed from the stresses of her old life. Carmen, now surrounded by nature's beauty and her daughter's constant care, felt a deep contentment she hadn't known in years. Sophia visited her every day, filling Carmen's life with warmth and companionship. One sunny afternoon, Sophia arrived for one of her usual visits, but this time she wasn't alone. Stepping out of an expensive Jeep, she brought Manuel with her. Carmen was so delighted to see him that for a moment, words failed her. She simply stood there, beaming at the sight of him, her heart swelling with joy. "Manuel, how did you end up here?" she finally managed to ask, her voice brimming with happiness. Manuel came to visit. Sophia chimed in joyfully, her eyes sparkling with a happiness that Carmen hadn't seen in a long time. It was clear that her daughter was truly content. Manuel laughed warmly and pulled Carmen into a tight embrace. "I promised I'd take you anywhere you wanted to go," he said with a smile. Then, turning to Sophia, he added, "But since your exams are coming up soon, we'll have to wait a little bit. For now, I'm going to find myself a nice apartment in the city center." Sophia looked at him in surprise. "What? But you said you were only here for a short visit." Manuel chuckled, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "I've changed my mind. I really like this little town, and I've already visited a fantastic restaurant here. After seeing my resume, they told me they'd be thrilled to hire me as their head chef." Sophia's eyes widened with joy, and she couldn't contain her excitement. "Seriously? That's amazing." Without another word, Manuel hugged her tightly and, to Carmen's surprise, kissed Sophia softly on the lips. "I'm not going anywhere without you, my dear," he whispered. "I promise." Sophia blushed, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I've waited so long to hear those words," she confessed, kissing him back with a tenderness that made Carmen's heart swell with happiness. Watching the young couple, Carmen felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She could see the love between them, and it filled her with hope. When they finally pulled apart, smiling at each other with the glow of newfound love, Carmen warmly invited them into her home. Once inside, she baked her famous pancakes again, and the young couple wasted no time in devouring them, their laughter filling the small house with an infectious joy. They chatted excitedly about the future, their dreams intertwining as naturally as their lives had come together. Carmen sat quietly, watching them, a soft smile on her face. She allowed herself to imagine her dearest dream coming true, sitting in the living room, reading sweet children's tales to her future grandchildren, while Sophia and Manuel laughed together in the background. The vision filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. For a brief moment, Carmen closed her eyes and let the happiness wash over her. Everything she had ever wanted was within reach, and for the first time in a long while, she felt truly at peace. The people she loved most in the world were now by her side, and that was all she needed. Now that you've heard Carmen's journey, what have you learned from her story? Share one lesson that touched your heart and something you will bring into practice in your life below this video. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.